Hello. Welcome to the Empowered Artist Collective podcast. I'm your host, Jennifer Apple, a multi-hyphenate actor, educator, acting coach, writer, dog mom, and founder of this vibrant community that champions artists as they carve out their own unique paths in this wild industry. Whether you're just starting out, in the thick of it, or seeking a bit of artistic fuel to expand your toolbox, you're in the right place. In this space, we'll have honest conversations, share actionable strategies, tips, and resources, and delve into the messy yet beautiful journey of living a sustainable, creative life. We unmask the reality of life as an artist, from navigating career highs and lows to nurturing your full human well-being. I chat with women and non-binary guests who share their personal stories, helpful learnings, and hearts to help you unlock your artistic potential, expand your knowledge, and show up fully and fearlessly in your artistry and daily life. Before we dive into this week's conversation, don't forget to hit that subscribe button so you never miss an episode. If today's chat resonates with you, please leave us a review. It helps us reach even more incredible artists just like you. And hey, feel free to spread the love. Share this podcast with a friend or post it on your socials, making sure to tag at Empowered Artist Collective and at @JenniferApple_ so we can chat with you there. All right, grab a cup of something cozy, settle in, and let's get to it. What goes into lighting a show, and how does a lighting designer shape an audience's experience without them even realizing it? In this episode, I talk to Amanda Zieve, who shares her journey from high school stage manager to Broadway lighting designer, working alongside legendary mentors like Hal Binkley. She provides insights into breaking into the field, the importance of observation and self-education, and how trust and collaboration are key to building a team. Amanda also discusses the technical and artistic aspects of lighting design, how angles, colors, and cue structures impact storytelling, while also breaking down the many career paths within the theatrical lighting sphere. She reflects on her Broadway debut with The Who's Tommy, the emotional highs and lows of the industry, and the balance between preparation and adaptability. Whether you're an aspiring lighting designer or just curious about the behind-the-scenes magic of theater, this episode sheds light, literally, on the essential but often overlooked art form. Enjoy. Amanda Zieve, hi.
Hello. I brought my coffee. I'm excited for our chat. Thanks for doing this. This is fun.
I'm so excited for you to be here. For anybody who does not know you, who are you today?
I'm Amanda Zieve, lighting designer for theater, mostly. That's my chosen medium. I've had the pleasure of working on quite a few Broadway shows as an assistant associate, and I made my Broadway debut with The Who's Tommy.
Yes, you did.
As a designer, and it was an amazing experience that I'm super grateful for.
We have yet to have anybody in the lighting sphere on this podcast. And as, you know, a podcast that really aims to try to just share as much as possible around this gorgeous, beautiful industry and complicated industry that we are part of, it's an important part that makes things happen. And it doesn't just happen accidentally. It happens really purposefully, I imagine, with a lot of work and patience and time. So I'm really excited to just dive in and like really pull back the curtain of what it actually entails, what it means, what you do, how you do it. So to start, I love an origin story. How did you find yourself in this sector of the industry?
Okay, so in high school, I had a drama teacher who pulled me in to just do some things after school because we would perform some scenes in class or whatever, and I like to run this little 2-scene slider that they had backstage for like basic lights, and I like to kind of arrange the legs. And he kept trying to encourage me, his name was Mr. Smith, to come by after school, and I was like, oh, I don't think so. And then finally he wore me down by giving me some like responsibilities. So he made it seem like I was really needed. Okay. And somehow that worked.
And were you at this point, were you like, you were an actor in this who was also doing?
No, I was sort of just like taking drama as an elective. I was like, oh, I like movies. And, I had seen a lot of theater growing up because my originally we're from outside of Boulder, Colorado. Okay. So my mom had season tickets to the Buell Denver Center Theater Group. Yeah. So I was fortunate to see a lot of, sort of like the heyday of touring shows, like the big Phantom, Les Mis, Miss Saigon. Yeah. And I always thought that was really cool, but I didn't really think about how that happened or who really did that. I just had experienced some of it and like enjoyed those evenings, but like I didn't really think too much of it past that.
Okay.
So whenever you're signing up for whatever you sign up for in high school, I just signed up for drama.
Got it.
So he talked me into coming by after school, and I was pretty immediately hooked. I was like, okay, so I get to build sets, I get to like hang lights. The big sort of like technical fun time was for the dance concerts. There were 2 every year. And we would like use dry eye slow fog. It was sort of just like the time when you really, and the music was great and our friends are up there like dancing. And that was sort of like, the heyday of the technical people's yearly experience. We also used to do stuff like run the follow spot for homecoming and, stuff like that. And it was I have no idea if the school environment is like this anymore, but it was very much like if you had an interest in it, you kind of just got to do as much as you wanted. Like, so I sort of quickly became a manager of sorts of like dispersing people with technical abilities to do certain things. And then by the end of high school, so I was very good at like stage managing. Excellent at it. I was very good at it. I loved to call a show. I loved to like manage the backstage crew and how a scene shift was going to go. But by the end of high school, I was really starting to get like more fulfilled by like turning on lights, even though I didn't know a lot about how that worked.
Yeah.
Like, I wasn't super technically inclined like some other people that did like lighting and sound. I was more like with my hands and like talking to people. So I didn't know like a lot of the computer stuff behind, we had a very early like computerized console that we only used some of the time. Most of the time was like little sliders.
Okay.
So I went to college at Cal State Northridge, which is actually an excellent film school, and they do have a decent theater program. I sort of just happened to get in there, so that's where I went. There wasn't a lot of thought behind it. And if anyone is in high school out there listening to this, I encourage you to do what I did not do, which was meet some professionals. Like if you're thinking at all in anything performance related that you're like, hey, I actually have a real passion for this and I want to know if I can turn this into like a job. Meet anybody that does that and makes money doing it.
Arguably, that's like why I have this podcast too. Yeah. That, young folks who are listening can like listen and be like, oh, this is a path, or like, oh, yes. I'm kind of interested in this thing. How do we do this? So yes, and.
Because 17-year-old me was like, well, there's no way I can like do that for a job. Like I like doing this thing and I work really hard at it, but nobody, like, I'm sure whoever gets paid to do this is probably way better than me, or I don't know what. It seemed very not attainable to me. So I went to college and I was majoring in theater, but I was like, oh, at some point, like, whatever the expression, the hammer will drop or whatever, and I'm gonna have to come up with like a different way to make money, like a real job. I definitely thought that for a long time. Yeah. So cut to, I'm a junior or so in college, and somebody has tipped me off to like summer stock.
Okay.
And the idea of what summer stock even is, and that you can kind of start interning in a professional environment without like necessarily feeling like you have the skills to like, just start working. And I was like, oh, well, this sounds like a good idea. Let's apply to some places, So I applied to Williamstown, didn't get in. Funny story about that. Cut to like many years later, a different lighting designer friend of mine, Rui Rita, we figure out, I was assisting him at the time. We figure out he likely rejected my application.
I love it. You're like, hey, yeah, I'm glad we have a full circle moment.
But... What year did you apply? I'm like, So anyway, La Jolla Playhouse, who happened to be in my hometown where my parents still lived, replied, giving me an interview to be a PA. So that went like great. I like loved it. And I was like, hey, you know what? It gave me a window into like what even doing this professionally even like looked like.
And what did you learn? I think that's the thing that I'm curious about. You're like, okay, this is now a profession.
Right. So I saw a lot of similarities. Like, okay, they're here making a show. Like I've made a bunch of shows, And I saw a lot of like, oh, the inner workings of personalities, and like, especially from a stage management standpoint, like what they do to manage a production, the creation of a production, and keep things on track, and the different ways they support the different artists in the room. I was like, yeah, this rings very familiar to me, of like this, some stuff is way better with better resources, and some people acted a little more adult in an adult manner, which was nice, and then sometimes they didn't, I was like, oh yeah, I've seen something like this, I've seen that kind of blow up. So that essentially started me working at the Playhouse. Like that, I think, was maybe an unpaid internship at the time. I can't really remember, which I'm not even sure that they do anymore.
Yeah.
But that led to like actual jobs backstage, working in the prop shop. So I had like a foot in the door.
Okay. And it wasn't extensively like in lighting specifically. You were kind of just like backstage doing this stuff.
Yes.
Got it. So
I sort of started like hinting at that I wanted to do more lighting, and like how could I kind of break into that. And the La Jolla Playhouse is pretty closely affiliated with UCSD, which has an excellent design grad program, which I happen to teach there on occasion, which is fantastic. And they, there's sort of a built-in opportunity where you get to do a residency if you're part of that program, and work as like an assistant on a new musical or something of that sort. So from a lighting, standpoint, that was sort of like the known way of kind of getting in with lighting designers that came to the La Jolla Playhouse. And I was not in grad school there. I was finishing a regular undergrad, at a Cal State school, but not a UC school, University of Cal. Yeah, exactly. So I was backstage, and I hadn't met Hal Binkley by this point, like on a social level. Like in those days, he was a major chain smoker. And if anybody doesn't know, Hal Binkley is a Tony Award winning lighting designer of Jersey Boys and Hamilton. And, for me, he turned out to be my complete mentor.
Oh, I love that.
Yeah. So I knew him on a personal level, like from literally smoking behind the theater, and I would chat him up a little, but I was like 20 and I didn't really know who I was talking to. I was kind of like, okay, I mean, I guess this guy lives in New York and like works. This was also, I was meeting him right before he won the Tony for Jersey Boys.
Okay.
So he had a amazing career, like a 30-year career at that point.
Yeah.
But I knew very little about like the world of Broadway or commercial theater at all. Like I really didn't understand anything about how it worked. I barely sort of understood like the breakdown of different jobs on a creative team and like how people really did those. I was like just sort of scratching the surface of like what that was. So an associate of Hal's came through town on a show of theirs, and he saw me reading this automated lighting. I think it's a programmer's guide to automated lighting. Backstage.
A book, just like sitting backstage reading a book. Okay.
Yeah, written by Brad Scheller, who I now know and is an excellent human. And he's like, why are you reading that? And I was like, oh, I want to get into lighting, but I don't really know how. And he was like, well, why don't you intern for us? And I was like, is that something I can do? Like, how do you do that?
Wild.
Yeah. And that was quite literally like the beginning. So that was the first time. So basically,
this is blowing my mind because it's kind of like one of those things where, I'm not saying to just like read on a subway for the sake of reading or just like having a book cover on the outside of your book for the sake of this conversation starter. But it really is like that became your calling card. That's wild.
Yeah. Yeah. And it was like, it was like manifesting before I really even knew that, like really what that meant or like how you do that. But I was like, I was, trying to self-educate as much as I like sort of knew how to do,
But there's something to be said about the fact that, I think so many of us have been in situations where you want something so badly and there's an energy of desperation around it, which again, it's like neither here nor there. It happens. We all want things really badly and like you feel what you feel. And then there's the ones that just like happen around, like, not that you don't care, but like, and this is not the same thing, but I think back to when I applied to grad school, I was doing really well in my career and a mentor was like, you should just apply and see what happens. And so there was something around, I think, my energy in those audition spaces when I went to audition for MFA programs where it wasn't like, I need this right now. It was like, this would be a really cool option that if this happens, I can then make a choice. And then it became a decision. And I feel like it's similar in that, like, you weren't showing up being like, hey, I know you're his assistant and I like really need an internship, or if you even knew what that was
Yeah,
at the time,
right.
I really want to get into lighting. Like, I want to like butter myself up to you. And there's a level of desperation versus, I mean, the fact that he simply just saw
Yeah,
you reading a book though, and was actually like now having
yeah.
that's wild.
So yeah, so literally the same team was back like 2 months later for a production of The Wiz that Des McAnuff was directing,
Okay.
who was still the artistic director of the Playhouse at the time. And I, sat the fourth in line down the table that was Hal's table, and like for the first time was like on headset and heard just conversations and how he went about queuing a show and what everyone's job at the table was. There was an associate, there was an assistant who was a UCSD grad student at the time. They were calling the spots, dealt with everything for the spots. There's a programmer who was like doing amazing things. And Hal was like the orchestrator of it all. There was very little like sort of technical talk, and there was a lot of like, I want more of this. He would occasionally call fixture numbers for like a very specific thing, but it would be like, oh, give me this. It was the Wiz, so we started in Kansas.
Yeah.
In this very sort of like sepia color palette, and then got to Oz, and then like
Vibrant.
everything became very vibrant, more colorful, amazing. So I was like, it was sort of like that show had a whole like color arc and everything, but it was almost like my education from how like was happening in real time as he was cueing the show.
So cool.
It was actually really cool. I mean, looking
back,
it was really cool. So I was, soaking it all in. There wasn't a thing he said on headset that I didn't like analyze for myself, like, oh, why is he doing that? Oh, I see why he's doing that, He asked me to keep a journal, which I did. We discussed it.
Wow.
And that same associate who had found me in the first place backstage had to leave tech for a few days for a family emergency. So Hal asked me to go sit in this associate's seat.
Wow, you jumped the UCSD grad.
Yes, and I now understand why he did that, because to take there was 4 follow spots on the show. 2 of them were like trust spots. There was a lot of like live IMAG camera work happening where the spot levels were like very important. So that was a whole orchestration that was going on.
That was like technical.
Exactly. Yeah. And if he had pulled that person out with that knowledge, then, that could have easily fallen apart. So he was going to kind of suffer through his part himself. And he figured like, if I wasn't doing good, he would just pull the extra weight or something. I can kind of see how he got to that thought process. Yeah. But because I had a stage management background, that was like the one thing I knew how to do. So Hal's process is not like how my process is now. Maybe one day I will get to this. It would be amazing. But he would see rehearsal. He kept a lot of notes in a script, but that was sort of the extent of the pre-planning. He didn't do any kind of like paper tech or like decide what cues were going to go where ahead of time. He kept a lot of sort of chicken scratch notes for himself. But then in the moment when they started spacing through a number on stage, he would just start creating cues like lightning fast. And it was his associate's responsibility to place those cues in a script and communicate them to the stage manager.
Got it.
And there wasn't a lot of discussion about what the cues were for. It was pretty much like, okay, he just took every light in the rig and pointed it down center and made it a time 0. That's probably the button of this number, right? Yeah. So you had to like just sort of deduce for yourself. And I must have been decently good at that part for the little exposure that I had to him so far. And that was really the beginning of ever working for him. Then I worked for him for like 18 years.
As his associate.
Yeah. So I started out as, it was a huge hurdle for me. I didn't know how to draft. I didn't know, really anything about the professional world. I knew how to assist people, and I knew how to like listen and observe. And then the rest of it, I had to like teach myself and pick up from Hal and other members of his team. So I started out where I would be like a San Diego local assistant for him. So I wouldn't draft the plot, but I would
pause for a second. For anybody who does not even know what that means, we're going to get technical as we go. What do you mean when you say drafting a plot?
Okay.
From the lighting perspective, like obviously,
perspective. Yeah, so there is a industry standard program that we all use called Vectorworks. It's extremely expensive. But the good news is, if you're a student out there, the student version is free. And I highly encourage you to dig into it very seriously while you are a student and on that student license, so that you have real skills that will justify the price you pay for paying for it when you get out of school.
Amazing. Love that.
So, there are other ways to draft a light plot, but in theater, we all use Vectorworks. So I didn't know how to use the program, and I also didn't know like real sort of conventional ways about laying out certain systems of lights, like, oh, the angle for cross light, the angle for front light. Like, there's sort of like tips and tricks that can be taught to you, or that you pick up along the way of, like, some of it is sort of feels like sort of just innate knowledge. I guess it feels like that for me.
For
but
you,
there probably
yeah.
is more. There's probably more mathematical ways of breaking it down. But I guess because I didn't learn that way and learned more by observing, I sort of just know, when I talk about with my associates now who do all my drafting now, I sort of look at something and have thoughts about it without seeing the exact math that they have like got, the way that they've arrived at their certain layouts.
When you say math, you mean like, okay, we have a plot above the stage. I'm going to break this down into like really remedial stuff. When we say, like there's the lights that are hanging, there's the lights that are down below, there's the lights that are the side lights. When you're saying drafting a plot and you're saying the math of it, it's like you only have, I'm going to make this so simple for my non-math brain. You have 10 lights above you, you have 2 on each side, and you have, let's say 5 in the front, just for numbers. When you say the math, you're like, okay, if I only have the 10 and I have essentially 4 on each side and the 5, then I know that I can only do X amount of things in X amount of rotations because of how many I have. Is that what you mean by the math of it?
And when you're a lighting designer, most of the time, and the lighting math, we call it photometrics, which is basically like the angle at which a light is going to come in and the type of light you're choosing. So how big it's going to be by the time it gets to where it needs to go, and therefore what it's going to cover at what angle. Mm-hmm. So the lighting designer, like what you just described, is sort of like a rep plot situation. Like if you were going to walk into something and be like, okay, they have these lights in these positions, how do I want to use them? But most of the time, you're actually deciding what lights are going to be in what location and how many. And maybe you have a set inventory, or maybe you don't. Maybe the whole thing is rental. So you're really deciding, not only where do I want to be able to have my, like what angles do I want to hit things at the stage, but then how I wanted to be able to divide up that control and like isolate that from those angles.
Hi, actor friends. Talking to you. If finding the perfect monologue has you feeling stuck, I've got just the thing. I've put together a free monologue selection toolkit just for you. It's packed with resources, free and paid options, plus tips for choosing, editing, and customizing pieces to showcase you. Head over to jenniferapple.net/freebie and stop avoiding the auditions that ask for a monologue or waiting for the perfect piece to simply fall into your lap. Dive into this free toolkit that I set up just for you that'll set you up to feel agency over your process and artistry. That's jenniferapple.net/freebie and get started on finding your next go-to monologue. So with that, I mean, now we're going to jump a little bit because now I'm kind of in it and my brain is here. Yeah. Like, obviously, Hal has his process, you have yours, you learn from Hal. So there's clearly like a symbiosis in some kind of ways of how you've learned to do some of these things. But for yourself, as somebody who, I'm deducing because you said that you operate differently. You don't go to, your tech day one without, and you go with a plan is what I'm deducing.
I have to have a plan for myself because I can't. And part of it, which I ask myself this frequently. Yeah. I wonder, I'm like, okay, Hal did this, by the end of his career for like 45 years. So he found himself in every situation under the sun. So, the busier you get, the less prep time you have to even devote to something.
Okay.
And so I think to myself, but I still can't go into, if somebody is like, hey, can you come for 5 hours and light this symphony concert? I'm like, okay, we have the 5 hours to do it. It's going to be sort of broad strokes, go for like a grander opera style looking thing, less cues, but gorgeous, highlight the symphony. Okay, got that.
Mm-hmm.
But you're talking like a commercially enhanced or commercial new musical.
Right.
The stakes are super high. Everyone is analyzing every part of the show. So if something doesn't work, it's highly possible that it could be thrown in your direction as being your fault as a life designer. So you have to be, it's like efficiency is the utmost important. At least I find myself in that situation. And maybe that's because I'm still, I'm not Natasha Katz and don't have like 50 Broadway shows to my name. So I still, yes, yeah. Even though I love Natasha, respect her dearly. So like, I feel, this need to prove myself constantly, but at the same time, I do have confidence in my ability.
Yeah.
And that has come from the years that I've been doing it already, 20 years, surprisingly. Yeah. So, with the cue sheet in regard to how I personally have to work, I wake up at 5 a.m. mornings of tech before a first pass through the show. Like, before you've completed tech of a show.
Before we get there, though, like, are you going into, say like one of the final, last days in the rehearsal space? Yes. Are you popping in multiple times before? I mean, I would imagine also this depends on the theater, the budget, all of the things. Exactly. Like, how often are you popping in before you even go there and or talking to the director and the creative team to get all the things and knowledge of the resources that you even have before you even get to the first day of tech?
Talking to the creative team a ton.
Okay.
Figuring out the real estate of the show and where I can fit lights and do all the things the set designer and the sound designer and the projection designer want to do. That talking happens a ton. But actually seeing the staging of a show, I usually save for, like you said, one of the final run-throughs. And
things are more set and not as...
Yeah, because there's no point for me to start getting married to ideas of I'm going to do this here if like that's not going to stick, because that's not... the staging part of it needs to be complete for then me to layer in on top of it.
Yeah.
Most of the time I've been in situations where that's not the case.
Yeah.
But most of the time, I wait until that part is sort of done.
And then I would imagine there you're like, okay, now I have the ideas and now all the things are happening. And now it's a matter of pre-plotting before you get to that first day of tech for yourself. Okay.
Yeah. And I typically on a new musical can't do that. Like I can't do the whole show before tech day one because I will have only just seen it like 2 days ago,
right?
So that's where I wake up at 5 a.m. I prioritize myself. I'm like, okay, I have to get to scene 4 for today. So I'm rewatching recordings of rehearsals. I'm sitting there with the script. I'm sitting there with dance counts of the script. And I'm like, really like, okay, I'm going to be trying to make these 20 cues for this number.
Yeah.
Which is not the way Hal would have done it. Like Hal would have marked up some of that stuff in his script and then he would have got in there. And as the choreographer started staging a dance number, he would have created cues. And it was a way of making sure that he didn't need to like over create cues. Like he would sort of start turning things on and be like, yeah, this for sure. He didn't make any bullshit cues. Okay. All of his cues were very purposeful and like it was a strong cue, which I think probably in my life I still make a few bullshit cues.
Listen, it's all relative. Everything's relative. Nobody even knows, Yeah. Also, like I would imagine a lot of these cues are happening so quickly and they're also happening in conjunction with so many other technical elements that arguably like a layman's eye won't even clock that it's happening. Yeah. That it's happening. I just want to like affirm that from like an outside perspective. I mean, I think what you're naming here is what I love about being a creative is the fact that there isn't one way to do it. Obviously we haven't had another person talk about lighting at all yet on this podcast. So you are the first of it, but even just naming within this conversation that your actual mentor does it completely differently than you do. Yeah. And I think there's something really beautiful about remembering that even the people who teach us, the people that we respect, the people that we learn from, that it's a take what works and leave what doesn't, or like find your version of the thing through it. And also being humble enough to recognize where you can grow and where you need more guidance, or where somebody else might have it figured out better than you might, or like trying something on for size and seeing how it actually fits when you're in
Yes.
it. When you were learning from Hal, was there a time that you were like, let me try to do it the way he does it, and then you discovered that it wasn't, or you were just like, I know that I do this well and I'm going to stick with what I know?
I think there's been sort of like a control element for me
Okay.
in terms of like a cue list,
Yeah.
that I've never tried it his way, because it's
Okay.
a little bit of like chaos that all worked out beautifully somehow for him.
Clearly.
But for me, I'm like, okay, now interestingly enough, I was just in a situation where I can't talk too much about it, but I was sort of lighting doctoring a different production. This was overseas
Mm-hmm.
with and the majority of the people in the room were not speaking English. So that was a situation where I had to walk in and just make adjustments, and I was seeing something that was mostly already built, and I couldn't do my normal way
Yeah.
of like, okay, I'm going to pre-plan what the cues are, and then I'm going to go and try to make as many of them as I possibly can. And the ones I can, I'll get the next pass and all that. I had to just like react quickly to like what was there, and like, make very real time priority decisions about like what I think needed to be fixed the most.
How did that
And
go?
okay, so good.
Well, then
and,
there we learned.
and I think that was sort of like my biggest chance to be like Hal, where I sort of am just like say something and then other people have to like make it
Mm-hmm.
so.
Well, there's
I'm
a level of trust too. I
Yeah.
think, and there's no judgment in either of these. Like, I think I see myself probably more in your process than maybe a Hal process. And also I'm in no way, shape, or form a lighting designer. But like, I think there's a lot of trust in who you put behind or along
Yeah.
that table for Hal, of like, I know that these people do their things really well,
Yes.
and that I'm going to do what I do really well. And because we all do what we do really well, everything's going to work out.
Yes.
And there's the other level of like, okay, there's the control part of, I know my vision. I want my vision to be done exactly how I want my vision, and the delegation part of it, rather than like, and again, there's no judgment in either. I think I fall more
Yeah.
with you when it comes to, things that I care about.
Yeah.
But I think that it really is an understanding of how one works, of like, do I trust people in a real way? Not that I don't think that
Yeah.
other people are talented, but just like that they will do
Yes.
my vision.
Yeah, and I picked that up from Hal big time.
Yeah.
Like, and just even understanding how that delegation could work. Like,
Mhm.
if we, the person who runs the Hal Binkley Fellowship with me, Ryan O'Gara, he and I get into conversations with our other peer designers that have massive, huge careers, talking about, because we worked with Hal for so many years on so many different projects and had to bounce around between things and in different levels of tiers of jobs,
Yeah.
including covering for Hal if he couldn't be there. We have this kind of unique perspective on like how you can, bring up a team with you and then, spread them out and use them
Yeah.
to like keep your work alive kind of thing. And for instance, my kind of main associate these days, Brandon Rosen, he was my associate on Tommy and a lot of other projects. I first met him when he was a grad student at the La Jolla Playhouse. And that was coming up on 9 or so years ago.
Yeah.
And like, the stuff that I would task Brandon with in the beginning of when we knew each other to what I task him with now,
Yeah.
It's grown exponentially, and
Yeah.
he brings a ton of stuff to our process that I would have never even thought of, and so like it totally evolves. Like,
Well, that's my next question is, I mean, we're bouncing around here a lot, but we're here. Like, how do you, now that you're in your process, you've been doing this for a while, I do want to talk about Tommy, because talk about a technical show, like for your Broadway debut being like the most like light and sound. I mean, it couldn't be more technical, like as a musical. Um, I'm curious how you do build your team, and what for you, like if you were to identify yourself and your skill set, where you are like, I'm not as great here, and that's what I fill a gap in, or these are the ways that I love the support for what I do. How do you build? How do you find
yeah.
your people? How do people who are not you, who potentially want to come into this world, start to find themselves at people's tables?
Yes. So, in terms of like a secret or whatever, or a tip, if you're out there and you want to be a lighting designer and you admire someone's work, it doesn't like, even if they're like Ken Posner, okay, like you should find a way to contact them and say so and ask if you can come observe some of their process, because most of the time they will say yes. And now there's some back and forth and people have very busy schedules and it may seem that they forget about you, and you should definitely not be emailing someone every week. But people, especially everyone I know who's been doing this for 20 years or longer, are very generous with like their time and wanting to give somebody like a foot in the door, because most of them had that themselves or really wish that they had that. And that was something about Hal that was so great, is that he would just sort of get a feeling about a person, myself included, and be like, well, you might not have skill XYZ, but you got this other stuff that I like. So let's see if you can get skill XYZ, And I think I operate a very similar way. Like for me, trust is one of the most important things at the table. Like I think of everyone on my team as like really part of my team. If I think anyone there is not like working towards the best lighting that show can have, or not wanting to support me, then that's likely the last time we're going to work together, because like I really need that. And I like to take people at all stages of their career, like in school, fresh out of school, been doing this for 10 years, and I like us all to share information. And I like to think that if you've worked as part of my team, you have now resources of my whole team. And even if you don't find yourself with us again, like you're spreading out to all these other amazing designers that are my friends. And like, we're here to help you, whether you're working on Team Amanda Zieve or not, it's sort of like you're in the club kind of thing,
Have you been using the same monologue for years? Are you gearing up to apply for BA, BFA, or MFA programs and need pieces for that process? Or maybe you just have no idea where to even start with monologue hunting? I get it, and that's why I offer monologue sourcing. This is a unique process where I find monologues chosen specifically for you. So many artists pick pieces based on external labels like type or for roles, rather than finding material that represents who they truly are. So here's how it works. We'll meet virtually and you'll share all about who you are, your passions, values, beliefs, and everything in between. Don't worry, I will help guide you through this process. Then I'll get to work finding monologues that fit you like a glove. With years of experience sourcing pieces for hundreds of artists, I've seen the difference it makes to have a monologue that genuinely feels like you. So, if you want to feel empowered about the monologues you bring into rooms and use for auditions, I would love to help you find them. And because you're a listener of the Empowered Artist Collective podcast, I'm offering an exclusive rate. Head to empoweredartistcollective.com/podcast promo to register and claim the special offer. That's empoweredartistcollective.com/podcast promo. I cannot wait to help you find monologues you absolutely adore. What exactly is the trajectory for lighting designers? Like what are the positions that are possible before you become like the lead lighting designer?
Yeah. So if you want to look at like a Broadway musical in terms of who's there for lighting in the building, you have the lighting designer, you usually have their associate, and you usually have their assistant, who oftentimes is calling spots, but sometimes is doing other things. Like, for instance, Isabella's Cabaret that's running on Broadway, there was more than one assistant, and a lot of that had to do with how much lighting was spread throughout the building when you're talking about, the different pre-show spaces and all that need to be lit.
Are these, and just to clarify, these, and this kind of operates similar, but maybe a little different to like, a director and their associate/assistants, like who is staying as the show runs versus who comes and sets and then leaves?
Okay, good question. So all the people that I just said so far come and set and then leave.
Okay.
So then there is sort of like the tandem team that is the electric side, who are the people that help bring the lighting designer's vision to fruition,
Mhm.
but also help make sure that the show, there's a saying that Jimmy Finnegan started calling every light every night, where, you're like the show that the designer left the building with is supposed to still be the show when they come back and see it in 6 months.
Mhm.
And that takes a lot of work,
Yeah.
especially if it's different fall spot operators, if equipment needs to be swapped out, like it takes eyes because things don't stay exactly the same. So it takes skilled eyes watching and maintaining that kind of stuff. So on the electric side, there's the production electrician who gets rehearsal reports every night and stays with the show, not necessarily physically there every day, but they're sort of in charge of the lighting staff on the show.
Okay.
So then there's a head electrician who most of the time is pressing the go button. And that is the person who you're really trusting to be looking at the stage and notice if something's off.
Mm-hmm.
Then there could be 1, 2, 3, 4 follow spot operators. Then they typically have trained subs or swing positions as well.
Mm-hmm.
Then there could be a deck electrician that would be responsible for like setting anything that lights up on stage, not props. Like if an actor is going to push a button and light up a candle or something, that doesn't require a deck electrician. But if you're going to, place a shin or swing a boom into place or anything like that, you need a deck electrician for that. Mm-hmm. And then there's the house electrician who runs the house lights and maintains like all the electrical stuff inside the whole theater, including like lights in the bathrooms. Yeah. So that's how it works on Broadway. At the regional level, there's like a production head, so like a lighting supervisor. That person, that's a tough job where essentially they have the similar skills that a production electrician has, but a little bit more localized to like the theater they work at all the time. So they're responsible for communicating with all the different lighting designers that might be coming to their space. They're responsible for staffing all the electricians needed for their space and like managing these load-ins and dealing with all these different rentals. Then there's also just like electricians that load in shows, which is a lot of aspiring designers find themselves doing some amount of electrician work, especially if you just first moved to New York City, because it's a way to pay the bills. Plus you get exposure to people doing lighting, and you learn a lot as well. You learn a lot from focusing other people's shows about the kind of light that you like or you find interesting.
Yeah.
And then there's all other types of jobs, including like people that work in shops and like manage all those kind of relationships and contracts. So yeah, like the path to doing those things, you could kind of come out of high school and start working, or you could go to school for something like that. There are a lot of design programs all over the country, and a lot of them offer there's like different pros and cons. That's like a whole other, whole other topic.
For sure.
But I encourage anyone who's like thinking about going to school for lighting to, ask around to any professionals, about what kind of questions you should be asking as you look into these programs, Yeah.
I would imagine some of it is like how much of it is on the like installation part versus like, the computer part of the actual like programming versus like how much of it am I actually having hands-on experience versus the conceptual part. Like I would imagine some of those. Yeah.
Yeah. And like who is your professors and like what facilities you have access to and like, are there design opportunities, or you really just help facilitate either grad students or professional designers' work, and like, how that fits in for you and what you think you need to grow on and all that.
I think also what has been wonderful about you breaking all of that down is remembering that like we're talking to you as the lighting designer, but you just listed 15 positions at minimum that are also within the lighting department that are also like fair game and actual jobs, you know, that like that people are making livings doing. And if you are somebody who like wants to be touching the physical lights versus somebody who wants to be like seeing it from the outside perspective versus somebody who wants to do like, you know, I just want to name the fact that if you are someone who is interested in this umbrella, that it doesn't necessarily mean it has to only be from the design perspective, which I think
You
is a
nailed it.
wonderful reminder.
Yes. And if you're, you know, if you like, many of the lighting supervisors I know around the country didn't necessarily start out there.
Mm-hmm.
And they've decided, oh, you know, I want to live in a certain location, or I want a more steady situation that's not freelance for whatever reason. I have a family, I need insurance, whatever, you know, multitude of reasons. So yeah. And the other thing about that is that for all of those jobs that I just mentioned,
Unionize?
if you
is that what you're going to say?
No, but that, but also like when you do all of those jobs, they make you better at all of the jobs. Like, and you like learn things about what people need, the communication that people need to be able to do each one of those individual jobs. And that just makes you like a better team member in all regards.
Yeah.
You know?
I want to bounce to Tommy.
Yeah.
Obviously we can get into like so many weeds about this. Again, such a technical show and like known for its like lights specifically. Right. I would love to hear how that experience was specifically as your Broadway debut, and how you navigated that. If you would go back, what you might change, what you wouldn't change, the learnings of it.
Yeah. I mean, you know, it's been interesting. Like Tommy closed after 5 months, which I wish it ran a year, but it didn't. But 5 months is, you know,
more than no months.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. So, you know, sort of in the span of a year, I got to like make my Broadway debut, watch it close, and actually reflect on it a little bit. That feels like more than a year, more than 6 months of reflection. It's sort of like if you told me Tommy was 4 years ago, I would sort of, that would make sense in my brain. Yeah. But I think part of it might have just been that like it was sort of so much, maybe like emotionally and whatnot, like packed into a condensed period. So, you know, when we did Tommy at the Goodman, it wasn't completely understood that we would then do Broadway. We were for sure going to do a tour, which we are still doing. We're going to put it out in September of 2025. But Broadway, you know, as a business is kind of complex right now. And we were just part of a season that had an insane amount of new work or new shows opening. And not all of them survived. And it did bring a lot of people into the theater, but it also was very hard to produce those shows. And it's still very hard to produce. Like if you're not like 90% capacity, you're kind of in trouble. Yeah. Which is, that's hard to do, even if your show is pretty good. Yeah. And like, I happen to think that Tommy was super entertaining, fantastic. I spoke to you already about our lead, Ali. Total superstar from my point of view. The choreography, stunning, projection, scenery, sound, I mean, we were like firing on all cylinders. Yeah. So, you know, in my mind, we had a giant hit. Did we financially have a giant hit? No, not really.
I mean, that's obviously where, you know, like we can have a whole discussion about like what it means to quote unquote be successful. Like, does that mean the financial success? Or are we talking about the artistic success? Like, you know, you're talking about it from the artistic perspective of it being a creative feat. Yeah. And that being a huge success, 1,000%. But then obviously if we're putting it in a commercial space, which is, it's a business, we have to remember that we're talking about quote unquote success in very different capacities. But I hear you.
Exactly right. And so, you know, it was a world, like Broadway is a world that is extremely familiar to me, but then the element of it actually being my work was still something fresh and new. Like I can remember on the day of our first preview, on the dinner break before our first preview, I was like back in the apartment I was renting, and I started to get kind of emotional because I was like, you know what? Like a bunch of people, 1,000 people are going to come into this theater and pay Broadway money to see my work.
Correct.
And I was like, regardless of anything that happens, like that is technically
Huge.
like check off a dream.
Huge.
You know, like
Huge.
yeah. And that was probably like the biggest sort of pinch me moment that I had. Like the rest of it, it was sort of like, yeah, like we're here, we're doing our thing. I happen to have worked in the Nederlander, which is where we were two other times. Like a lot of it was very familiar to me, and like I knew how to do it. But then it was just enough different that it was very special. And, you know, I felt really taken care of on that show, which is not, you can't always say that. I mean,
how did it come to be?
So the director of Tommy is the same as the original director of Tommy, Des McAnuff, who I had the pleasure of working on at least maybe 10 shows with Howell over the years. When Des was going to do this, what he hoped to be a Broadway revival, he'd obviously directed the original. He had done a sort of more like the original version up in Stratford in like 2013 that Howell actually lit.
Okay.
And so at some point after that production, he decided that he wanted to sort of take it in a different direction, and he wanted a completely new team, and he wanted to like make the visual language different from what he had done on Broadway before.
Okay.
So my name got somehow thrown into the mix, and he called me up and asked if I wanted to do it. And I was like, yeah, of course I want to do it. Like,
it's just like, it really just goes to show like relationships are huge, you know, and if you're building something, especially for somebody who's like reviving it, but differently, it's just, there's obviously pressure again in a commercial space where you're trying to make the money, but also from a creative perspective, if you're trying to re-envision something that you've already done, you know, like I would imagine there was so much pressure in that. And so to know that your name came up because of the relationship that you genuinely built is, I would imagine, probably just like even more of an icing on the cake, where it's like you didn't have to, not to say like applying for a job and getting it isn't amazing, because it's so hard. We all know it when we audition all the time. And to just get a phone call after like, I've worked with you, it's been many, many years. There's a trust going back to that.
And we
trust.
can't really, like, from as a designer, we can't really apply for things, you know, like you can, hear something's happening and have your agent send a message. That typically doesn't lead to anything. It's like, you know, there's a core people that start assembling a team, usually like the lead producer and a director. And at that point is when they need to start considering you. And you usually have very little control, unless you have a personal relationship with one of those people, about even getting your name included on that list to be considered, you know?
So how do you do that then from the get? Like, how are you making sure that your name is on the top of people's list?
I'm not. I am putting my 100% effort into all the projects I do and hoping that it organically pays off.
Okay.
I think there's other people that go about it different ways. You know, I mean, publicity and social media is becoming a bigger part of a designer's life than it ever used to be.
Yeah.
So, you know, there's such thing as somebody's seen my work and then finds me on my website. That happens now. There is such thing as, for me, one of the great things about Tommy, even though it wasn't really long running, was that a lot of industry people saw it. So it's sort of, you know, put my name.
It introduced you to them.
Yes. Yeah. And if it was people that had previously thought of me as an associate or just didn't know me at all, it was a little bit of a foot in the door of, I really like what this person did here. Maybe they should be considered for this project. Then directors, I have director friends who speak to people like numerous times. I've had a director think of me for something that says, or, you know, maybe a theater put my name out there. And then they called around other director friends of theirs that had worked with me. And then I get it like a good review. That happens. That definitely happens. Yeah. But I'm not like beating down doors and cold emailing people that I want to work with. Maybe I should be doing more of that, honestly.
I'm here to tell you how to do your job. I don't know.
Yeah, but I'm not currently, you know, it's not like people are like, hey, I'm trying to staff designers for this revival, blah, blah, blah. Let me know if you're interested. Like, that just doesn't happen.
Yeah.
So, you know, you have to sort of get like, there's some kind of movie where you get like preconceived. I don't know. It's like you have to like get in there and
Yeah.
you have to stay current,
Yeah.
like people fall off, they get new favorites,
Yeah.
and then like what somebody that used to hire you 5 years ago, that you don't even come into their mind anymore.
Yeah. I want to go back to just like your creative process one more time. And maybe this is a little bit more technical, but we didn't really talk as much in this way. It's like when you see something on stage in front of you, how does it like lock into your brain? Are you like, okay, I know technically that like if I want their face to be in focus, I clearly need something like in their front of their face? Or is it more like because I know that the director wants this, say, sepia tone, I need to be playing in this different kind of playground and therefore I actually can't light in that capacity because that doesn't work in the world? Like, what are you doing technically?
Yeah, I mean, I think there's feelings you get from watching certain things. Like, when there's sort of like age-old rules, like comedy needs front light. Like if you're trying to highlight dancer bodies, you need to use side light.
Mhm.
Like there's stuff you just sort of like know, but then there's so many various combinations of those things that's when it kind of you start to feel a certain way. Like when you're for me, it's sort of like I think about it as a cueing structure first. Like this moment needs to pull in or pull down or isolate. This moment needs to expand. And then you start thinking like how you want to do that. And
Okay.
like for sure, the storytelling parts like have to be seen and absorbed.
Yeah.
That's what, good lighting is. Like you have to make sure that whatever the important story pieces are being highlighted and being seen and being absorbed by the audience. So that's sort of like the technically how you do it. And then
Yeah.
the next piece is like color choices, and like how much color variance you want in a particular moment in the show. And that's where, like, if anybody else looks up stuff I said about Tommy, it's no secret that we've said that we were very controlled about the color palette of
Mhm.
that entire production, because we kind of threaded Tommy's different traumas with like a color,
Mhm.
like threads of a tapestry kind of thing, so that by the time that he could like, go into the world of pinball, that was sort of a kaleidoscope opening up moment that looked visually different from how we got there.
Yeah. I feel like lighting design for me feels similar to costume design in that if it's working in conjunction with everything else, you don't notice it.
Yeah.
But if you really stop and focus and isolate your eyes onto what's happening, you're like, oh, like, there's something so beautiful about it being this thing that's supporting all the other elements or making you notice all these other elements because it isn't necessarily the focus, which is ironic because it's
Yeah.
literally lights.
Right.
But like, I think there's something so beautiful about the fact that so many of us, and I'll speak on behalf of myself, just take for granted that it's just part of the
Yeah.
universe because yeah, I want to see the thing that's happening on stage. It's like, yeah, but
Right.
how are you seeing it? Like,
Yeah.
let's remind ourselves that this is an art form, that
Right.
somebody had to go in there and choose that you were going to see it with this tone, from this angle, from this perspective,
Yeah.
with this intensity or not. Like that was
Yeah.
a choice that a human being went in with and made so that you can then absorb all the other elements. And I
Yeah.
think in some ways, I would imagine, maybe you don't experience this, but maybe in some ways it feels a little unforgiving in that way because it's like it's not your story to tell. Like you're not,
Right.
but at the same time, like if it wasn't for the lighting designer and the whole team of people who are setting all that stuff up, you wouldn't see the thing that's happening.
Right. Yeah.
Like,
And you're totally right. And I ask myself sometimes that when I get like skipped over for a nomination or something, I'm like, oh, maybe,
no,
like,
but
oh,
like I know exactly what you're gonna say. Yes.
yeah.
Mhm.
I'm like, maybe I just did it so well that like people don't understand what I'm doing.
No, 1,000%. 1,000%. 1,000%. Again, I'm not sitting in your chair, but I would imagine actually, yes, that there was
Yeah.
like a seamlessness to it that you didn't notice it. And because you didn't notice it, you're not paying attention to it. And therefore you just think that it was. But like,
Right.
how did it become just the thing that you aren't paying attention to that's supporting all of these other
Yeah.
elements on stage? I just want to affirm that it's another aspect of the storytelling that we're a part of, especially when we're talking about it from a
Yeah.
theatrical perspective, that so often we can take for granted. And yet the painting of that picture is the thing that allows us to actually feel
Right.
what we're feeling in conjunction with these other elements. It's just,
and I think that's really like the beauty of the live theater element to me, is that like being the collaborator that sort of glues a lot of that together.
Yeah.
Like, I don't actually spend a ton of time thinking about that exact part of it, but now that I am, it's like I really actually enjoy helping like a lot of the different visions, that like bringing them together, you know,
and come to life, and
Right.
light, come to light.
Yeah.
Yeah. It's awesome. Awesome. We bounced around so much, and I could talk to you about so many more things that are probably more technical and probably more like, in the weeds. But even just having this beginner conversation to kind of peel back the layer of what it is that you do and how it operates and how the world is so much more of an ecosystem than I think so many people realize. I'm really grateful that you joined us in this space,
Yeah.
and shared. I mean, for anybody who wants to hire you and wants to work with you, or is curious about learning more, or wants to pick your brain or reach out or whatever, what within your boundaries is the best way for people?
My website is great, amandazieve.com. I have a contact thing on there, and it'll shoot directly to my email, and I usually respond within a few days.
I love it.
So totally cool. And I'm, happy to, I'm really kind of an open book. So if anyone wants to reach out and hear more about something I said, or literally just anything. And if you're a young person out there and you're trying to get into this, we run the Hal Binkley Fellowship, which is in conjunction with the Hemsley Lighting Programs. And you can find a link to that on my website as well. Or you can just Google Hemsley Lighting Programs and we'll show up, the Hal Binkley Fellowship. So, but you don't have to apply for that. You can just reach out to me as well if you just want to talk or share your experience and talk through things. Happy to do so.
I'm super grateful that you were here. I'm really pumped for you and all your future endeavors. I'm cheering for you as a female lighting designer in the world that needs more. And I'm grateful that you're in this space. So thank you again for being here.
Totally. Thank you for having me. I had a great time.
That's it for today's episode. I hope you walk away with some fresh insights, feel inspired, and a little more empowered to take the next step on your artistic journey. Remember, whether it's a small shift or a big breakthrough, every step forward counts. You've got this, and we're here cheering you on every step of the way. If you found today's episode helpful, don't forget to hit subscribe so you'll never miss out on the discussions we have each week. And if something today really resonated with you, please leave us a review. It truly is one of the best ways to help other artists find our podcast and join in on the conversations. Plus, we feel the love too when you do. And don't keep all this goodness to yourself. Share this episode with your people or post about it on social media. Be sure to tag at Empowered Artist Collective and at @JenniferApple_ so we can see what's landing for you and keep the conversation going. As always, thank you for being here. Thank you for listening. And thank you for being a part of this incredible community. Keep creating, keep thriving, stay empowered. I'm Jennifer Apple. Until next time.